Hello and welcome back to Sane and Rational History. Today's video covers the 5 Japanese midget submarines that attempted to enter and attack Pearl Harbor. Now this video came about because of a debate that I got into with someone from NOAA about what happened to the 5th Japanese midget sub. I was originally hoping to get this video out on December 7th, but law school finals conspired against me. Also, if you like this kind of naval history content, please like, comment, and subscribe to help this video in the algorithm. The Japanese midget submarines tend to be a lesser-known aspect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. At least 2 made it into the harbor, and one of the submarines appears to have been successful. The Imperial Japanese Navy deployed 5 midget submarines as part of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Type A midget submarines were about 78 feet long and had a beam of about 6 feet. They could travel at 23 knots while surfaced and at 19 knots while submerged. Their primary armament was 2 17.7-inch torpedo tubes. The vessels could only fire up to 2 torpedoes. The torpedoes could only be loaded into the tubes from the outside of the submarine, so reloading them in combat was not an option. Each Japanese midget submarine would have a very small crew of just 2 people, one to con the ship, and one to adjust ballast and trim. The 5 midget submarines were brought to the vicinity of Pearl Harbor by full-sized Japanese submarines. They were expected to navigate into the harbor, attack targets in the harbor, and then rendezvous with the mother submarines outside of Pearl Harbor. Number 5. The least effective of the submarines was the one launched from I-24. Number 19 ran aground on a reef and was captured on December 8th after failed attempts to enter the harbor. Attempts were made to scuttle the submarine, but the charges failed. One crew member drowned, and the other, Kazuo Sakamaki, became the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by the United States. The submarine was recovered and used on war bond tours and eventually ended up in the National Museum of the Pacific War in 1991. Thanks in part to Kazuo Sakamaki, the story of this submarine is likely the most well-known out of all 5, which is why I won't be spending a ton of time on it. Number 4. The first midget submarine engaged by U.S. forces, Number 20, was sunk about 5 miles outside the harbor by the destroyer USS Ward at around 6:37 in the morning. These were the first shots fired in the war between Japan and the United States. The submarine was caught when it tried to shadow the old freighter the USS Antares, which was towing a target barge, into Pearl Harbor. USS Ward and a PBY spotted the midget submarine, and the USS Ward quickly closed the distance and engaged it with guns and depth charges. This submarine is ranked 4th on the list because it failed to get close to the harbor. It also failed to survive longer than a few hours, and it gave the United States a win even before the surprise attack had really started. In fact, if Pearl Harbor had been put on alert after the midget sub encounter, things could have turned out very differently, especially if fighters were ready to fly. The Ward did its duty and did report that it had depth-charged a submarine in 2 different radio communications. But the facilities at Pearl Harbor remained unprepared, and fighters were not put on alert, so this submarine gets placed 4th on the list. The submarine in the number 3 position on this list, the midget submarine number 18, was sunk by what was likely a depth charge. The wreck was discovered in 1960. The bow section, which still had its torpedoes, was removed from the vessel and was dumped at sea. The rest of the submarine was eventually returned to Japan. This submarine also never made it into the harbor and was found in Kiehi Lagoon. There is some speculation as to what happened to the crew of the submarine found at Kiehi Lagoon. No bodies were found within the submarine, which means the Japanese sailors could have escaped. It was quite some distance to shore, and swimming upwards of a mile while injured from a depth charge attack would not have been very easy. There is the small chance that both of them managed to make it to shore and then blend into the population of Oahu. Still, I remain somewhat skeptical, and I wish we had more information on what happened to those 2 crew members. The midget submarine in the 2nd spot, submarine number 22, actually made it into the harbor and attempted to torpedo a U.S. seaplane tender, but it was in turn sunk by the destroyer USS Monaghan at around 8:40 a.m. Hey, it's the first submarine on the list to actually make it into the harbor, even if it didn't hit anything. Well, it did hit a dock in Pearl City, but that doesn't quite count. And now, on to number 1. Number 16 is the most interesting out of all of the submarines. There are two general theories as to what happened to this midget submarine. The most recent theory is that the sub actually made it into the harbor and inflicted at least one hit on the Oklahoma and/or West Virginia. Why is this theory popular? Because the submarine appears to have been captured in this photo. The object is roughly the size of a midget submarine, and there are two torpedo wakes that can be traced back to the object. As mentioned earlier in this video, this type of midget submarine only carried 2 torpedoes. There are 2 primary theories as to what caused the rooster tails that can be seen in this photo. The first, and probably the most popular, is that the submarine fired its torpedoes, causing it to become unstable, letting its contra-rotating prop breach the surface of the water, causing the rooster tails. The second theory is that a shock wave from torpedoes exploding against the battleships on Battleship Row caused similar instability. Though I used to wholeheartedly believe that these rooster tails were caused when the submarine launched its torpedoes, I actually find the argument that they were caused by some kind of underwater shock wave far more compelling. I read a very interesting article from USNI that said the following, quote, "From the cavitation effect, the midget submarine was forced in a vertical upward motion. This action, compounded by the change in trim after she fired her torpedoes, exposed almost the entire sub's contra-rotating propellers, as the surface wave from the previous air torpedo detonations passed over and into the rotating propellers." Some try to dismiss this photo by saying that the midget submarine and the rooster tails are just some form of ink smudge. However, the torpedo wakes that seem to trace back to this mysterious midget sub-sized object aren't so easy to dismiss. The best counter-argument to the submarine actually having entered Pearl Harbor is that the USS St. Louis, a U.S. light cruiser, claims to have encountered a midget submarine attempting to enter the harbor. I have seen some sources claim that the St. Louis was even fired upon by this midget submarine. However, I've also heard theories that this was a case of misidentification and that the St. Louis misidentified some kind of minesweeping device that was being towed by a U.S. ship attempting to re-enter Pearl Harbor. If the St. Louis was actually fired upon, it would create some problems with the math. Since each submarine only carried 2 torpedoes, and most of the torpedoes have been accounted for in one way or the other, it would make it mathematically impossible for the 5th submarine to fire 2 torpedoes at Battleship Row if 2 torpedoes were launched at the St. Louis. I tend to lean towards the side that St. Louis misidentified some other phenomena and that it was not fired upon by one of the midget submarines. This is primarily due to the fact that there's a fair bit of information that seems to back up the theory that the sub actually made it into Pearl Harbor. There are claims that a 1942 report to Congress described a Japanese midget submarine torpedo that was recovered from the bottom of the harbor near the battleship West Virginia. Though I have not independently confirmed the claim's veracity, an LA Times article claims that it was an 800-pound torpedo. I assume that this must refer to the warhead weight, as even an air-launched torpedo would weigh far more than that in total. In that case, the warheads of Japanese air-launched torpedoes weighed somewhere around 450 pounds, the warheads in the Japanese midget subs weighed somewhere around 800 pounds, which would line up with the torpedo mentioned by the LA Times. However, I have also heard that this torpedo had a 1,000-pound warhead, which would not match with the Japanese midget subs. The Oklahoma also seemed to suffer more damage below the waterline and capsized very quickly. The West Virginia did not capsize because of the quick actions of her crew, who immediately started counterflooding compartments to combat her list. Oklahoma's damage was so severe that there was little opportunity for counterflooding. Oklahoma's quick demise can also be attributed to its lower tonnage and older design. Oklahoma only displaced around 27,000 tons, while West Virginia displaced around 32 or 33,000 tons. Each ship was hit with at least 7 or so torpedoes, though the exact number is not known, Both ships' torpedo defense systems were breached, so the higher tonnage likely played at least some role in the survival of the West Virginia. Still, if the Midget sub-torpedo fired at the West Virginia was a dud, and the one fired at Oklahoma was not, this could help explain why Oklahoma capsized so quickly. The torpedo did have a warhead mass of around twice that of an airdrop torpedo. There are 2 radio communications from the Japanese Midget sub that were made to its mother submarine. One claimed success, and the other claimed that it was impossible to navigate. So, once the submarine had fired its torpedoes, it likely tried to escape the harbor, but was prevented from doing so for one reason or another. It could be by that point that there were enough U.S. warships on alert to prevent any exit from the harbor. From that point, it seems like the Japanese Midget submarine ended up in the relatively calm West Loch. At that point, the crew likely scuttled the vessel, and they may have tried to swim to shore. This is another instance where we don't know what happened to the crew of the submarine. Midget Submarine number 16 was found cut in 3 pieces outside of Pearl Harbor. How exactly did it get there? Assuming that the submarine did end up in the West Loch, in May of 1944 there was a terrible disaster in the West Loch, where hundreds of sailors were killed or wounded when a piece of ordnance was mishandled and exploded on a landing ship tank. A cleanup operation picked up the debris from the disaster and dumped it out to sea. There is a lot of speculation on how the sub was found and what was found inside. There are also 2 separate times when it could have been cut into 3 separate pieces, which is how it exists now. It could have been cut up that way when it was first recovered from the West Loch, or it could have been cut up that way in 1951 when it was supposedly found in water outside of the harbor and dumped further out to sea. This also admittedly opens up the possibility that the submarine never actually made it into the harbor and was just dumped in a similar location to the debris from the West Loch disaster. All sources seem to agree that this submarine was destroyed by a scuttling charge, which I tend to think favors the theory that it made it into the West Loch and was recovered there. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. I hope you'll like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any information that you think would be interesting to add to this discussion, please put it in the comments below. Well, I hope you all had a Merry Christmas, and Godspeed.